You were one of the first persons who discovered the role of the cardiovascular system of the brain in the psychoactive effects of psychedelic drugs. Can you explain that?
I wouldn't say I was the first to discover it, but I was the first to, with Bart Huges, who was a Dutch scientist who introduced me to the concept, and then with his companion, Joe Mellon, I understood it so totally, and it so changed my understanding of how the underlying physiology of psychedelics, particularly LSD, which is what I was working with. I realized this is key information for humanity. And so at that point, which was in 1966, I devoted my life, decided to understand better how psychedelics work in the brain and how we can use them as invaluable tools for humanity to therapy, understanding consciousness better, and also kind of opening up the human soul. So I consider them absolutely invaluable. And I decided this is my life's mission, because I'd always been, from early childhood, devoted to the mystical experience. And I'd studied comparative religions and mysticism. And this all came together and made total sense that this is a tool which can lift you up there. And also you can use it to improve cognitive functioning and all sorts of other elements. So as it used to be called in traditional societies, it's the food of the gods.
Can you explain us the mechanism, how psychedelics can turn off what we call the ego?
Yes. The ego is what now we would call, or partly call, the default mode network. But in the days, which is Freud and onwards, when one called it the ego, what we understood is that what psychedelics do, now one understands, then one didn't know, because one didn't know about the serotonin 2A receptor, but that through the serotonin 2A receptor, it changes the tone of the vascular walls. So it increases the dilation of the arteries and increases the constriction of the veins, venules, the little veins, and so you end up with more blood in the capillaries. And that happens all over the brain, all over the body, but all over the brain. And so suddenly there's an increase in capillary volume, which provides more oxygen and glucose metabolism, i.e. it increases the resources of the energy resources for the brain. And that has always been the hard limit of energy resources. And so there are other ways of increasing it, i.e. you can do it endogenously through adrenaline and through other techniques, or through exercise or fasting or breathing or meditating. There are all sorts of other ways you can do it. But with the psychedelic is accepted by the serotonin 2A receptor and brings about the changes. And LSD is one which marries most closely with the receptor. In fact, more closely even than serotonin itself. And that's why such a minute amount has such a big effect and lasts so long. And so what we realized, but without scientific verification back in 1966, is that what the psychedelic is doing is increasing the energy of the brain. And through that you increase simultaneous activity, which now we know through the research we've done, is an increase in connectivity through the brain. And I don't know if you know, but I set up the Beckley Foundation in 98, after 30 years of studying it, because I realized only through becoming part of the establishment could I, as someone who left school at 16, had no letters after my name, could I have the effect and do the research I wanted to do as a foundation. So I became a foundation. And then I was lucky enough to get the top scientists, including Albert Hofmann and the top neuroscientists, about 20 of the top scientists, on my advisory board. And then I started work setting up research. The first one actually was with Franz Wollenweide in 1980s, whatever. Anyway, long ago. And so I was always looking to try to see this change in capillary volume as being underlying the mechanism. But at that time, brain imaging wasn't at that point. And also, the scientists weren't interested in the vascular system. They were interested in the neuronal system. And no one wanted to talk. It was old-fashioned and not what they wanted to talk about. So we went on working on it. And so to your question of how it affects the ego. So the first research, and then I promised Albert Hofmann I'd break the taboo on his incredible compound and set up the first brain imaging study for his 100th birthday. But I kind of underestimated the power of the taboos, so I set up the study at Berkeley University, and Albert Hofmann provided the LSD. It was wonderful. People funded it, and then it was aborted before it was completed. So then it took me another 10 years before I persuaded Dave Nutt, who was on my advisory board, that we should set up a collaboration studying psychedelics, as he then was at Imperial. So we started the Beckley Imperial Psychedelic Research Program. And I always wanted to do LSD, but we had to wait another X years before we could do LSD because it's so taboo, where the psilocybin, no one knows how to spell it or what it means, so it's much easier to get ethical permission. So we did our first work with psilocybin, and then I forget, in 2012 or something, 13, we did LSD. And we saw, because I was wanting to look at the changes in cerebral circulation, so that's what we were looking for. And strangely, we noticed that we picked up the data on the reduction of blood to the default mode network. And that's very interesting because the default mode network is hyperactive, underlying psychological illnesses like depression, addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a network which doesn't stop working. So it's whenever you stop doing a task, suddenly, boom, 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 I'm so depressed, I blah, blah, blah. And so bringing down the function of the default mode network, we thought might be a good approach for depression, which it was. But so that's really, but it didn't show the increase. Now, it's an interesting thing, PET did show an increase, but fMRI doesn't. So the different forms of brain imaging have different results. So actually now I'm just setting up this program called, I call it the double-headed program, which is totally focused on LSD. And because brain imaging has advanced a lot, and all our previous studies have been using an fMRI T7 Tesla, no, T3. But in this research we're using, which is at King's, I'm doing at King's and UCL, we're using a Tesla 7, which is more than twice, 3 times strong. So we'll get 3 times more, better definition of what one's looking at. And another thing which we're doing in this study, which is very exciting, is we're doing a personalized study. So we're doing each participant individually. And there'll be about, 12 or more hours in the brain imaging on a full dose of LSD. And we'll choose people who also meditate, because ideally what I'm wanting to look at is the mystical experience and try to understand better what are the underlying mechanisms that create that experience, because our and other people's previous research has shown that when one's treating, say, treatment-resistant depression or addiction, or those people who undergo a mystical experience have the best results. So it increases efficacy for the person to have a mystical experience. So why is that? It's basically because it increases connectivity and neuroplasticity. And we've done research which shows how LSD particularly increases neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, and anti-inflammatory. So those are three very important factors we know that psychedelics have. And it's just very fascinating, I think, that science having kind of thrown out the spiritual out of society, polite society. Now, the latest science, at the very center of the science, we're finding that the mystical experience is the key to the healing. And so, in this particular study, we're trying to see more clearly what are the different elements. So we're also using MEG, which is a wonderful instrument to look at brain activity and connectivity. So we'll combine that with fMRI. And then we'll also, the next day after, we're going to have 2 doses. After the second dose, we'll give participants interviews at a very deep level, and then we can correlate any breakthrough, any particular interesting psychological happening with the brain function. And so we'll have to choose which centers of the brain we particularly look at, which is very exciting, and then get it at much better definition than ever before. And I'm very interested in looking at certain centers, particularly, like the caudate and the Putman, and because they are very associated with intuition and the mystical experience and experience thinking. So they're very interesting centers, and they are slightly, maybe people think, antennae which pick up out of ordinary experiences, anomalous experiences. And so the hope is to further refine what we know about the mystical experience, because if we can learn to encourage that to happen by the way we set up the study, obviously that increases the chances of successful outcome in the treatment of people. But I'm always interested in the psychedelics. They're very non-specific. Using them as medication is one incredibly valuable way. But they can also open up the internal structure of one's cell and thing, and use healthy people, use it as well as ill people and benefit. So I'm very interested in just building our understanding of how it works so we can better, we can optimize the beneficial effects of it. And so this study for me is very exciting because at Oxford I studied mysticism and comparative religions, and when I first took LSD I realized, well, this is amazing because this produces, or potentially produces, it creates the landscape in which one can most easily have a mystical experience. Obviously the saints and children have them automatically, endogenously, and as a child I used to have them. But through careful use of a psychedelic, one can actually use them as tools to reach that state. And so then, because I'm really interested in pushing to the test, the full test, which now as brain imaging technology improves, begins to be possible. And so another of the studies in this double-headed program is with Yale, scientists at Yale and Cornell, where they're experts in the microvasculature. So for the first time, we're doing a study where it's a study with mice, giving them LSD and studying with optical technology the changes in the vessels of the arteries, capillaries, and the veins at a micro level. And then the second part will look at it at a bigger level and what is the neuro relationship between the nerves and the tone of the wall, muscular wall. And so that's very exciting. And then other studies are going to look at with other technology to try to picture together, because all the different technologies have slightly different effects. PET has a different effect to fMRI, slightly contradicting effects. So we hope to get further to the bottom of the truth of it. And I think that the hypothesis of it increasing the capillary volume of the brain, to me, makes complete sense. For one, I'm a farmer's daughter, and as a farmer's daughter, you know that if you irrigate land to what it needs, you get a better productivity. And I think the brain's the same. I mean, I think the brain is the desert, the adult brain. We lost the volume of blood when we stood upright and the skull closed. So we're slightly short of blood in the head. And so we developed this ego mechanism, which is a conditioned reflex mechanism by which we direct the blood where it's most needed for survival, basically. And that means that a lot of the brain gets insufficient blood to function at a conscious level. And what a psychedelic does is increase the energy level so that more of the brain can function together. And this dominant default mode network loses its dominance by its blood supply being reduced. And so the whole brain comes interactive. And that we've seen in our brain imaging studies. I don't know if you know them. There's a lovely one with LSD where there it is in placebo, and then after LSD, the whole brain is lit up with connectivity. And there's another one with psilocybin where you have the two circles. One is the placebo, and then the post-psilocybin one is vastly more connectivity. So that's, in a sense, I mean, I say to myself when I look at that, how do people think that happens other than there being more energy? It seems fairly obvious that it's more energy. And it's rather remarkable that no one's been thinking we should investigate. Is the whole change defined by the fact that there's an increase in energy supply? And so that's half this study, because the three big studies is on that, King's at Yale and in Argentina. And then the other half is on the microdose, because I've always been a great believer in the use of lower doses of psychedelics as well having an effect. Because for one reason, the full dose, which gives the mystical experience, or can give the mystical, not that it always does at all, but can, isn't suitable for certain people, maybe, in the sense that if a person's too old, it might be threatening to their heart or if certain forms of neurodegeneration, So I'm very keen and have done research for a long time now on the microdosing approach. And I think one can treat them, I used to call them in the 60s, psychovitamins. They kind of spark up the brain and make one think more interestingly, have more fun, have more energy, have more spark, basically. And I think that's a great asset to be able to do that in a totally non-toxic way. So I think there's lower doses, and I don't only mean microdoses by the modern definition, which is whatever, sub 20 mics. I mean playing the lower level and also doing more research I'm planning to do at King's, looking at the micro level. In this study we're looking at the macro. But next study I want to look at the micro and then compare different substances. How does the mystical experience of LSD differ from the experience of 5-MeO-DMT, which is a completely different experience, and why is that, and what underlies those changes? But at the micro level, I've been doing research with neurodegeneration, with palliative care, and more recently with Alzheimer's. And I had this wonderful experience last year of a very wonderful old lady of 97 who was a poet and artist and very special. And then she had Alzheimer's and vascular dementia for quite a long while. And it got very bad, so she was in a kind of total apathetic, vegetative state, which her son, who looked after her, was deeply worried about. And so the family and the carer, with her previous agreement, decided to give her a microdose of LSD. And the result was transformative. And from being this frightened, unhappy to look at old lady, she became suddenly vital and joking with her son and saying how wonderful she felt. Could they read some poetry? So then that went on, and because by dosing carefully at the lowest dose, which brings the results you're looking for, i.e. vitality and having fun, it worked. So that was such a strong study. I decided I must do a sound clinical trial to test efficacy and that it works. And I had the good fortune to meet the head of geriatrics at Basel University, and he was amazed at the image and immediately agreed to collaborate with me and got a team together. So we're doing a study in Basel, just now we're getting the ethical approval, and it will soon start. So that's very exciting, because if a proportion of people with Alzheimer's can benefit in the same way this old lady has, and others who I know of by report, it would be wonderful. And also I've designed a new type of care home where the potential of microdosing psychedelics would be part of the treatment, but also it would have doulas trained in psychedelics whose job is to stimulate, amuse. So it would be like a lovely home with music and visitors and children and animals and a microdose. So that's what we're trying to set up now. And Switzerland is such a good place because they've got a much better regulatory framework than more or less anyone else. But hopefully it will move, and soon the Netherlands will have it because you're always very advanced here, and Oregon or other places. But at the moment, Switzerland is the best place because you can get compassionate care use there. And so I think and also I'm doing a study in Jamaica with palliative care, terminally ill cancer patients on that would use natural psilocybin, but then we'd introduce LSD too, because I think LSD has some very special qualities, which could be, and I used to advise the Jamaican government on drug policy, so I know them, and they're very keen. I say they should make Jamaica into an island of well-being where people can go and have really good treatment to replace the banana industry. And they like that, yeah. But there's so much potential with psychedelics in so many different areas. It's like a feast, it's like a wonderful orchard with ripe fruit just waiting to be picked. And the problem is, how does one get the research done quickly enough to make it possible for people to receive these treatments? I mean, we did the first research at the Beckley Imperial Research Program to test psilocybin on treatment-resistant depression and got very positive results. But it could be 10 years before that reaches the public potential. And that's a tragedy because people suffer so much from these conditions. And we really need a kind of fast-forward program where, you know, one looks at efficacy, one looks at potential safety and dangers, and if possible, makes the whole process quicker, like Switzerland is wise enough to do. And I hope the UK and other countries will take up that system.
You have been fighting for a greater recognition of psychedelics for several decades now. And now it seems that there is a greater recognition of psychedelics and more attention and more money is coming to this field. How does it make you feel?
I feel very happy by that. I mean, for 50 years, I've been considered slightly mad. And as I grew up in an isolated kind of kingdom, I really actually didn't mind too much because I was never particularly, I had a rather eccentric father who said to me, whatever the government tells you, always do the opposite, in the sense that, you know, if you think you know better, don't let it put you off. And so that's always been my principle, but also my principle has been, how do we incorporate it into society? How do we help society realize the potential of these treatments? And that's why, I think it was late 1960s, when prohibition was closing, I realized that the kind of only way through this awful constriction of prohibition was with the very best science. We had to prove, demonstrate, that these compounds, which I knew from experience, like I overcame nicotine addiction in 1966 by deciding it's a disgusting habit, I'll give it up. So with one trip of LSD and a decision, I overcame, because I'd started smoking when I was 13 or something, because I was very tall and I was told it stopped you growing. So by the age of 22, I was quite a nicotine addict. But it showed, and funny enough, that study later, when I was talking to Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, I had $5,000 to do some research with. And he said, well, what would you suggest? What would you like? And I said, well, I overcame nicotine addiction with LSD, and a psychedelic. Why don't we try that? And now that's become, as you know, a very big, successful study. With, at one point, it had 80% success rate. And the depression study we did had 65% success rate. So what is being shown is that these compounds can bring about changes which are quite unique, because it's proven that they're non-toxic. At least you can't kill a person on an overdose of LSD, whereas a small overdose of alcohol or nicotine can kill you. So they're pretty safe, although obviously psychologically they can be dangerous, so you need the right set and setting for them to be used. But they're amazing how basically a fungi can interact with the human physiology and bring about these changes in consciousness. And what I find actually fascinating is how our ancestors, the first, I think, recording we have of art, which I think is at Chauvet in France, which is, 36,000 years old, they were producing in the bowels of the earth art which has never been surpassed. And one can tell that the hand who painted that art in the pitch dark of the underground were on elevated states of consciousness. And so they knew how to use these compounds right back then. So I do think that psychedelics are very interwoven with our evolution into Homo sapiens cultural world. So I think that they're just incredible tools for us to learn to use well. Obviously, one can misuse them, but when we grow our scientific understanding of how they work and follow the kind of common sense rules of safety, they can be just incredible at a kind of non-specific way, from deep healing to cognitive enhancement. I mean, like I used to play Go, the Chinese game, passionately in the 60s. That was our relaxation in the evening, was playing Go. And what I could test, because it's a game where there's no chance, and it's very intuitive. It's pattern recognition, intuitive pattern recognition, basically. And we played thousands of games, and we took it very seriously and wrote them down, but playing intuitively, quickly. And I won more games if I was on LSD and keeping my sugar level normal. And that's actually another very important understanding, if our hypothesis is true, is that as it's an increase in energy supply, the higher level cognitive neurons, which are late in development, are much more extravagant in their use of energy than the more low-level functions. And so if you're doing something demanding high-level cognitive concentration, you need to keep the sugar level normal, not too high, but normal. And I knew that from my father, who was a diabetic, came back from the war. So from age of 3, I was his kind of carer and went everywhere with him. And what I learned is I had to keep putting sugar in his mouth, or he lost the grip and would do all sorts of funny things, like running over roundabouts and different things which you wanted to keep, because if he went on, it got serious. And so I realized how interconnected the glucose level is with cognition. And so when I learned this in 1966 about the glucose level, I realized, because before that I thought LSD was absolutely incredible for mystical experience, for fun, for all sorts of things, but not really as a way of life. But once I learned about how you need to keep the glucose level normal, I realized that then you could do high-level cognitive functioning, but at a higher level than your normal level. So I found the use, this knowledge, just changed my life, actually, to a higher, more fun more productive level. And as the survival of humanity is, in a way, learning to adapt, I mean, we're a brilliant animal, but totally mad, actually. I mean, we're pretty psychotic in what we can do and in the mistakes we make. And I feel that the acceptance of, not that everyone will take psychedelics or should, but I feel that they should be accepted within the web of society so that those who want to take them can take them legally, and the youth can learn how to use them legally and safely, those who want to, because I think the number of people I've met who've done incredible things in life, and they say, well, I've never done this without having taken LSD, psilocybin, or whatever it was. And I think it can lift one's performance to a slightly better level than one would have without it. That's my personal opinion. And so criminalizing them is actually insane. I mean, I've been quite a lot into drug policy, and I've done papers and books and worked with the top policy people and presented at UN and all of that sort of thing, and written how the UN Convention should be rewritten to allow individual countries to have their own drug policies which they consider best for their countries. But not one word of the UN conventions has been altered. And it's just not true that these are among the most dangerous compounds in the world with no medical applications. You know, that has been proved to be untrue. So we really need to move to the level. I mean, I wrote a public letter 11 years ago or whatever, saying how we must change our drug policies globally to accept what we now know scientifically to be so. And it's slowly happening, but it's very slow in the progress. And that's very cruel on people who most need it. And so hopefully now that the kind of momentum, it used to be like pushing the rock, syphilis, up the cliff face. But now society is much more open to it. And that's a wonderful advance. And I run what I studied, Beckley Foundation, which is a non-profit charity. And so it's dependent, because I don't have funding, it's dependent on people donating. And that, funny enough, has got more difficult in this climate because there's such a gold rush kind of feel about it. They quite naturally, people rather want to put their money where the gold rush is rather than in the bottomless well of non-for-profit. So anyway, I would say that it's all wonderful what's happening. We need the for-profit work because bringing a compound to regulation and having to go through phase 3 research costs hundreds of millions of pounds, dollars, whatever. And so one needs the for-profit mechanisms to help the movement forward. But I think it's quite important in maintaining the non-for-profit, because then one is just motivated by what is the most interesting, what is the most potentially beneficial for society, and one is not guided by which are the most profitable. And I think there's a value in keeping both sides. So, I'm very excited, I'm delighted. Both of my sons actually have now got involved in it, which I'm absolutely delighted. And there are wonderful people involved in, like at this event, you've got thousands of new people coming, which is wonderful. So there's a general, and kind of Middle England woman's magazine will have an article about the benefits of microdosing LSD, which is unheardable 10 years ago. So it's all going in the right direction. And so far, we haven't made any terrible mistakes, but there's always that fear that 1 or 2 mistakes could turn. But now I think it's got beyond that point. So I think we're at a good starting point. But there is so much research to be done to kind of increase our understanding of cognition and consciousness generally. And I have to say, I'm very interested in anomalous, anyway, in anomalous experiences, which is outside science at the moment. But I think that's only because science hasn't got around to understanding them or how they work. So if we can shed light on how they work, which I'm hoping to slightly begin doing with this study I'm doing, hopefully they'll get more within the arms of scientific research. So it's an exciting time we're at, I think.